Welcome to Bedroom Forensics. Now, this is a little bit of a different episode. You all know that I'm a former CSI and a criminologist, but I also have a degree in psychology, and I'm always on the lookout for what's going on in society, looking at our behaviours and how we're changing and adapting throughout history. So this is going to be a bit more of a walk down a psychological path. And I noticed that last year there was a real move towards changing the way people think if you didn't like what they think. Oppressing voices and being offended was actually really quite popular. And obviously not to the level of true oppression, or maybe in some people's heads. It seemed that while some people aimed for equality, others were feeling oppressed by the changes that they thought they were being forced upon them. The so-called Karens and white cis men. Now, of course, no voice should be muted unless it truly calls for hate. But it seems on both ends of the scale that people chucked out sweeping statements just to cause a scene or go viral. Now, one such term that I noticed made a resurgence this year was toxic masculinity. And it's about time we educate ourselves on what that really means. Now, toxic masculinity has been described as the negative behaviours or attitudes that stem from adhering to traditional masculine gender norms. Mouthful, or even more basic, men need to hunt, they can't hunt, they lash out. Now, the term was invented alongside bum bags and perms back in the 80s. It came from the mythopoetic men's movement started by Professor Shepherd Bliss. The movement used myths and fairy tales as a way to interpret challenges facing men in society and help them bring back that guttural masculinity that's been denied to them by work, women, family, etc. Now, the group wanted to give men a way to reveal their true selves within a safe haven with other like-minded men who wanted to cry and yell and get away from the women folk. Now, the movement itself hasn't really grown much over the last decade, but what has is the cannibalisation of the ideas led by Professor Bliss. And now they've taken on a life of their own and turned into an excuse for why there are bad and mad men out there. Really, that's such a sweeping statement, and worse, it's often used as a reference to excuse violent behaviour, homophobia, racism, sexism, etc., etc. In a nutshell, the men can't help themselves. They are just a product of society. It's like saying if men cried more, there wouldn't be any domestic violence. Well, isn't that a kind of victim shaming? But there are still studies suggesting that toxic masculinity is a psychological phenomenon. In 2005, Terry Kuppers looked at men's prisons and concluded that men showcase what he called toxic masculinity when they needed to aggressively dominate others. They would be violent verbally, physically, or perform sexual acts to assert their dominance, and use terms like real men take it, real men don't cry, to get their own way. Kuppers also believed that this was a heterosexual problem. But his research, when broken down, could also be referred to as pack mentality, and that's widely seen in gangs, prisons, and even groups of chums. There's also a whole host of research into patriarchal societies and how having no father figure can lead to a man being toxic. Well, this too is quite vague, because if we go back to the beginning of my start of my chat, this term is a sweeping statement for everything and anything. And when anything is so generic, how can you start to fix it? You know what? It's a bit like IBS. Once you've been diagnosed, you're considered dealt with. But actually, IBS affects everyone differently, and it's caused by a whole bunch of different things. So why have you just been labelled? Oh, there you go. To put you in a neat box and not have to delve any deeper. Just like, wait for it, toxic masculinity. So then why do we use it in everyday language? Is it to try and find a logical reason why some guys are just douchebags? Is it to start a gender war? Do we even have toxic femininity? Well, yes, but that's a whole different aspect. What I think is men should not be defined by their masculinity, toxic or otherwise, but by their character and behaviour as individuals. And honestly, the term has no place in 2021. There are real barriers for men today. According to Samaritans, in the UK, men are more likely to commit suicide, with the highest rates between the ages of 40 to 49. And it seems that some of these men are lost and they're not getting help. It is an odd time. We look to the past and see what we've been told men should be: breadwinners, veterans. Yet we look to the future and we see our children embracing fluidity. And some people, some men, just don't know where they fit, and they're not being given any help. And there are sometimes reasons why men lash out verbally and physically, but start trying to suggest that they all crave the privilege and patriarchy of the past is unfair to not only them, but their victims too. I think we've moved away from being shackled by society norms. The younger generation are making their own norms, and they are whatever they want them to be. And thanks to the internet, they are finding their spiritual homes. And although there will always be trolls, there are also supportive, like-minded people out there. And it's time we give all people the help they need, equally. No more box ticking. So let's shrug off terms that were invented in an era where shoulder pads, perms and cocaine were seen as the height of fashion. And let's look into how we can grow as a society.